I do not have that member managing my finances. Saving for a rainy day. The definition from the Labour opposition, saving for a rainy day is $65 billion in the poop. That is saving for a rainy day. No, sir, that is not my definition for saving for a rainy day. Sir, we must earn before we spend. We must earn before we spend. Even my 11-year-old son knows this. He's been doing this since he was 4 years old. He had to do his chores and earn pocket money so he could actually send it to his sponsored child since he was 4 years old, sir. He knows that you must earn before you can spend. But Labour doesn't seem to know this, or they've actually forgotten this, or they just don't get it. Saving for a rainy day is not $65 billion in the red. They continue to want to borrow and spend big. And to achieve this, they want to have higher taxes and more debt to spend big to win votes. That's the only reason. I wonder if individual members on the opposite are so irresponsible with their own finances. I doubt it. So then, what makes them think that they can do that with this country's finances? Sir, Labour will mortgage our families' futures with a borrowing program that would leave our children with a legacy of debt and deficits. New Zealand must realise this and make sure we never go back to that dangerous situation we've just managed to get ourselves out of, called the 9 long years of Labour government. Sir, today I'd like to take a little moment to talk about the Korean people, bring the Korean perspective here. The Korean history isn't as long as my colleague, the Indian community, who've been here for more than 100 years. Korean community, the migration to New Zealand only sort of began really big in the 80s. Now the population is about 40,000. The motivation, however, for moving to New Zealand hasn't really changed. Most have lived in Korea. They were born there. They had a professional, busy lives. Not really, want from too many things, but they had a desire for New Zealand, and in New Zealand, that New Zealand had plenty of. That is clean air, the wide open spaces, more relaxed lifestyle than what they had become accustomed to in Korea. When they settled in New Zealand, families were, however, separated, sir. Often mums and children would actually live in New Zealand, and the fathers had to actually go back to Korea to actually work because they could not find jobs in New Zealand. And I'd like to sort of address what former speakers did. I think it was Nanaia Mahuta who actually sort of talked about what did the national government do in terms of providing employment. I'd like to actually ask the Labour opposition, what did the Labour government in 9 years actually do for these migrant communities who were actually leaving the country, and all of our young people who were leaving this country because they could not get jobs? They talk big now that they're in opposition, but they did nothing. Anyway, a lot of Korean people own small businesses, but there are some who have actually contributed greatly to the New Zealand economy, even without their English and lack of New Zealand experience, and the desire to achieve a better standard of living, a more prosperous life, and a more engaged life, and a more active life. That is something very, very strong in the Korean community. And they actually are very, very excited because we have John Key-led government. The National Party is in government, and they're very excited for New Zealand because finally they feel that New Zealand has become aspirational. Let me give you an example of one of these people. John Chong is someone I don't really know very well. I've actually heard about him over the years, but back in 2003, he purchased a Gisborne sawmill. The business was in receivership and had been closed down for 8 months, and all the workers had been made redundant. He re-employed 50 people who had been made redundant by the closure of this mill and invested in and upgraded the facilities and machinery. The improvements significantly improved the quality and quantity of wood that they actually produced. And the mill and his successful, he actually established a market overseas and sold 70% of his production overseas, offshore. As a result, he turned a dead company into profitable enterprise. And this national government is turning this country around to be profitable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.